Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to begin by confessing a certain suspicion that has haunted me through the years of my study of human nature. It is the suspicion that the people who are called good, the kind, the selfless, the morally impeccable, are very often the ones who have made the most brutal sacrifices upon the altar of repression. Their smiles are not always born of peace. They are frequently the delicate curtains drawn over a battlefield in the unconscious. We must, therefore, learn to distrust what appears purely virtuous. For what society calls good is not necessarily the product of health, but often of a well-disciplined inner conflict, a triumph of the superego over the instinctual life, of fear over freedom, of guilt over desire. You see, morality is not a natural flower of the psyche. It is a cultivated plant, grown under the harsh sunlight of social expectation. The so-called good person, the one who never offends, who never raises their voice, who always yields, this person has not eradicated aggression, sexuality, envy, or pride. No, they have merely exiled these forces to the dark kingdom of the unconscious. There, in that subterranean chamber, these drives ferment, twist, and seek expression in disguised forms. The compulsion to please may be the displaced form of a forbidden wish to dominate. The gentleness may conceal a hatred so repressed that it must wear the mask of tenderness. I recall a patient, a woman of extraordinary sweetness, whose every gesture was marked by grace and sympathy. She never allowed herself anger, not even a flicker of it, for she considered it unworthy of her Christian upbringing. But in her dreams, night after night, she saw herself strangling a small animal, sometimes a cat, sometimes a bird. She woke in tears, horrified, and insisted that she would never hurt even a fly. But I told her, precisely because she would never hurt even a fly, the instinct must find another outlet, another stage upon which to act its tragic play. Her unconscious had preserved what her consciousness had forbidden. Her kindness was the surface expression of a repression so total that her dreams were left to perform the vengeance of her disowned instincts. This is the great paradox of moral virtue. It is both the pride and the illness of the civilized psyche. Civilization demands that the drives, sexual and aggressive alike, be curbed for the sake of coexistence. Yet the psyche does not forget what it has lost. Every renunciation leaves behind a residue of frustration, which, when unacknowledged, transforms into neurosis. The man who is excessively kind may, therefore, be engaged in a lifelong struggle with his own unconscious hostility. He gives because he cannot bear the guilt of his suppressed desire to take. He serves because he cannot forgive himself for wanting to command. His love, though it appears pure, may be the elaborate disguise of his fear that hatred would otherwise destroy him. In the analytic room, I have learned that goodness, like every other human quality, has its infantile roots. The good person is often the child who once learned that love must be earned by obedience. When the parent's affection became conditional, the child internalized the rule that only by pleasing, by being gentle, by being unproblematic, could they remain safe. Thus, kindness becomes the defense mechanism of a wounded psyche, a reaction formation against the terror of abandonment. To be bad is to risk exile. To be good is to survive. So the moral saint of adulthood is often the terrified child of yesterday, still bargaining with the ghost of parental love. It is necessary to remember that repression does not annihilate the instinct. It merely forces it to change costume. The libido is a cunning actor. When it is forbidden to appear as erotic desire, it may disguise itself as altruistic devotion, as the impulse to heal, to serve, to sacrifice. When aggression is banished, it may return as moral righteousness, indignation, or an exaggerated sense of duty. The unconscious knows many disguises, but beneath every costume, the same primal energies pulse, eros, the force that seeks to bind and unite, and thanatos, the impulse to destroy and dissolve. The good person imagines he has conquered thanatos, yet more often he has only forced it to hide behind his smile. One cannot analyze the phenomenon of kindness without confronting the superego, that severe and watchful internal authority which whispers, "You must not." The superego is the heir of parental and cultural prohibitions, the inner judge who rewards compliance with pride and punishes deviation with guilt. It is the superego that drives the good person to perfection, that transforms desire into duty and pleasure into shame. But the superego is insatiable. The more it is obeyed, the more it demands. Thus, the individual who strives most to be good often becomes the one most tormented by self-reproach. The saint, you see, lives in constant proximity to his inner executioner. If we could look beneath the behavior of the so-called virtuous, we would find not peace but tension. Their kindness is not the serenity of a reconciled soul, but the fragile equilibrium of one at war with itself. Every polite gesture, every self-effacing smile, every eager act of service is accompanied by the suppressed whisper of a forbidden impulse. The good person's unconscious says, "I want to strike," but the ego, trained by the superego, commands, "You must embrace." The result is not wholeness, but a dissonance sustained by repression. This dissonance reveals itself in subtle ways. The person who insists upon pleasing everyone often harbors resentment that leaks through irony or fatigue. The charitable individual who gives endlessly may secretly crave control over those they help. The moral crusader who condemns others' immorality may be persecuting the very instincts he has buried within himself. Such are the paradoxes of the psyche. Virtue can be the sublimation of vice, and vice can be the rebellion of a strangled virtue. When we call someone good, we are really acknowledging the success of their repression, the extent to which they have domesticated the wild forces of instinct. But domestication is not elimination. The drive continues to live beneath the surface, sometimes emerging in symptom, sometimes in dream, sometimes in the quiet exhaustion that comes from sustaining the mask. Many of my patients have come to me not because they were wicked, but because they were too good, too disciplined, too self-denying, too moral to live spontaneously. Their neuroses were the trophies of their virtue. They had sacrificed instinct for peace and found only anxiety. The question we must ask, therefore, is not, how can one be good, but what is the cost of being good? What psychic mutilation, what inner suppression is required for the maintenance of the ideal self? To be good, in the conventional sense, often means to amputate portions of the self that do not conform to the collective ideal. It is to live under the tyranny of an internalized censor, to fear one's own impulses as though they were enemies. And yet, the psyche is not a simple battlefield of right and wrong. It is a theater where contradictory forces must find expression, lest they destroy the stage itself. Consider, for instance, the dream in which a saintly person commits an unspeakable act. The dream does not indict the dreamer. It reveals the balance of psychic economy. What the waking mind suppresses, the sleeping mind releases. The unconscious knows no morality, only necessity. It must express what has been repressed. Thus, the dream of violence may coexist with the life of gentleness, the fantasy of seduction with the appearance of chastity, The dream is the royal road to the unconscious, but it is also the revenge of the repressed. It proclaims, you may deceive society, you may deceive yourself, but you cannot deceive the psyche. When I speak of repression behind kindness, I do not intend to condemn kindness itself. On the contrary, I wish to restore it to its proper depth. True kindness, born of self-knowledge, differs profoundly from the kindness that is born of fear. The first is the act of an integrated ego. The second, the symptom of a divided one. The good person, in the neurotic sense, does good not because he loves, but because he must not hate. His virtue is a defense, not a gift. He performs goodness as an exorcism against his own unconscious. And here we find the tragic beauty of human morality. It is both our glory and our illness. Without repression, civilization would collapse into chaos, yet with too much repression, the individual collapses into neurosis. The moral law that binds society is also the psychic law that binds desire. We are creatures forever caught between instinct and ideal, between the pleasure principle and the reality principle. The good person is the one who has chosen to suffer this tension consciously or unconsciously, believing that peace lies in denial. But denial is not peace, it is merely silence before the storm. So, when you meet someone who radiates goodness, do not assume that they have transcended their passions. Rather, consider that they may have buried them alive. Their benevolence may be the monument built over the grave of their instincts. And if you listen carefully, you may still hear the faint beating of those imprisoned hearts within them, yearning to be acknowledged, not to destroy virtue, but to make it real. For only when the unconscious is reconciled with consciousness can kindness cease to be repression and become compassion. If in the first movement of our inquiry we have unmasked kindness as the disguised child of repression, we must now descend deeper into the mechanical heart of that repression itself. For repression is not a single act, but a system, a whole economy of psychic censorship that regulates the flow of instinctual energy between the forbidden chambers of the unconscious and the polished parlors of the conscious mind. It is not enough to know that something has been repressed. We must understand how it is kept there, how the psyche sustains this invisible quarantine against its own desires, and how, paradoxically, these same desires return, transformed, to construct the very edifice of morality. The first mechanism we encounter is reaction formation, a process by which the psyche converts an intolerable impulse into its opposite. The one who feels hatred toward a parent may become excessively devoted. The one who harbors lust may become rigidly puritanical. The one who fears aggression within themselves may become unfailingly gentle. The emotion expressed is the opposite of the emotion repressed. But the energy is the same redirected, inverted, and intensified by the very prohibition that gave it birth. Reaction formation is thus the engine of false virtue. It creates the kindly neighbor who cannot admit envy, the humanitarian whose boundless compassion masks a secret disdain for the weak, the saint whose devotion to purity conceals an unconscious fascination with sin. One must not underestimate the ingenuity of the unconscious in this work of disguise. The ego, anxious to preserve its self-image, recruits the full machinery of the defense system. Projection is among the most cunning of these defenses. It allows the individual to see in others what they cannot bear to recognize in themselves. The good person, intolerant of their own hidden aggression, will find aggression everywhere, in the rudeness of others, in the vulgarity of the world, in the imagined malice of strangers. They become the moral critic, the guardian of etiquette, the prophet of civility. They cast their own repressed drives outward and then wage war against them as though they were external threats. Thus, the very energy that was once directed inward as guilt is now externalized as moral crusade. It is this mechanism that explains the curious zeal with which certain people condemn what they secretly desire. The preacher who denounces lust with trembling passion, the philanthropist who detests selfishness while secretly controlling others through generosity, the friend who insists upon peace yet provokes endless conflict, all are participants in this theater of projection. In them, the unconscious has performed its dark alchemy, transforming forbidden impulses into moral indignation. It is a spectacle that civilization both rewards and depends upon, for the projected instincts of individuals fuel the collective enforcement of morality. Society is, in truth, a conspiracy of repressions, a vast network of projections masquerading as order. But repression alone cannot explain why such individuals often appear serene, even radiant, in their goodness. For if repression were merely the act of burying desire, we would expect constant torment. Yet many live apparently tranquil lives under the banner of virtue. The explanation lies in sublimation, the highest and most creative of the defense mechanisms. Sublimation does not deny the drive. It redirects it toward a socially acceptable aim. The artist transforms forbidden erotic energy into aesthetic beauty. The physician channels aggressive instincts into healing. The teacher converts dominance into guidance. Sublimation is repression's most sophisticated offspring, the reconciliation of instinct and civilization. However, sublimation is not as pure as it seems. It still draws its energy from the primal sources of libido and aggression. The painter who creates scenes of divine love may be painting the outlines of his own unfulfilled passion. The philanthropist who builds orphanages may be seeking redemption for a cruelty long repressed. Even our noblest acts are fed by the undercurrents of what we dare not name. That is why the study of human virtue can never be separated from the study of the unconscious. The same psychic energy that builds cathedrals also fuels obsession. The same libido that gives birth to civilization also threatens to destroy it. In the laboratory of analysis, we observe that repression operates not only as prohibition, but also as transformation. When a drive is pushed into the unconscious, it undergoes a distortion, a dreamwork of psychic chemistry. Desires are displaced, condensed, symbolized. A wish that was once sexual may reappear as ambition. A murderous impulse may re-emerge as perfectionism. The longing for the mother may transform into devotion to abstract ideals. These transformations are not accidents. They are the price of repression. The ego cannot annihilate instinctual energy. For energy, in the psychic sense, obeys the law of conservation. It must go somewhere, even if it must disguise itself. The process is not unlike the disguises of a dream. In dreams, the forbidden content of the unconscious appears in symbolic form so that the sleeper's ego may tolerate it without awakening in horror. A man who dreams of climbing a staircase is not consciously aware that he dreams of sexual union. A woman who dreams of bathing in clear water does not immediately recognize the erotic purification her unconscious seeks. The dream work performs the same censorship and transformation that repression performs during waking life. Both are strategies to preserve the fragile peace between instinct and conscience. But this peace is illusory. The repressed always returns, and when it does, it demands recognition. We must therefore consider symptoms, the physical and psychological manifestations of this return of the repressed. The overly kind person who suffers from chronic fatigue, the moral perfectionist plagued by anxiety. The helper who cannot rest. These are not merely temperamental quirks. They are the bodily inscriptions of psychic conflict. The nervous system becomes the battlefield upon which the war between Eros and Thanatos is fought. The ego, caught between the demands of the id and the prohibitions of the superego, collapses under the tension, and the symptom emerges as a compromise formation. The symptom says, "I will express," but in disguise. Thus, a gentle hand trembles with unspoken rage. A pious prayer conceals the yearning of the flesh. A tear of compassion hides the satisfaction of moral superiority. In these moments, one perceives that repression is not only a psychological process, but a form of self-deception elevated to an art. The ego cannot bear to see itself as it is, so it builds a mirror that reflects a purified image. Yet behind this mirror, the unconscious continues its restless labor. What is called goodness may therefore be a hallucination maintained by the ego to defend against the unbearable truth of ambivalence, that we love and hate the same objects, that tenderness and cruelty coexist, that our noblest acts are never free from the fingerprints of instinct. Civilization itself rests upon this same structure. In Civilization and its discontents, I argued that the progress of humanity is purchased at the cost of individual happiness. The instinctual renunciations required for social order breed frustration and guilt. The superego, born from this collective repression, becomes harsher as civilization advances. It demands not only moral behavior, but moral purity, a perfection that no living being can achieve. Thus, the more civilized we become, the more neurotic we grow. The good person, under this regime, is not the free citizen of reason, but the disciplined servant of the superego's impossible commandments. If you listen to the voice of the superego in the virtuous individual, you will hear not the melody of love, but the rhythm of punishment. The good person's morality is rarely joyous. It is anxious, vigilant, often tinged with self-loathing. Every act of kindness is accompanied by the fear of failing, every impulse of self-care by the sting of guilt. They live not in harmony with their conscience, but under its surveillance. Their goodness is not an expression of life's energy, but a perpetual act of self-defense against the chaos of desire. The repression that began as protection ends as imprisonment. There are moments, however, when the machinery falters, the repression weakens, the forbidden impulse breaks through, and the individual experiences what he cannot explain: a sudden anger, a reckless act, an erotic dream, an inexplicable melancholy. These eruptions are not moral failures, but reminders of the psyche's structure. They show that the unconscious, though repressed, remains alive. It demands not judgment but understanding. To interpret such lapses as sin is to miss their meaning. To analyze them is to give them speech. The task of analysis, then, is not to destroy morality, but to expose its roots. We must see that behind every moral demand stands an instinctual renunciation, and behind every renunciation, a suffering. To analyze the good person is to reveal the complexity of the human condition, the perpetual tension between the desire for love and the fear of rejection, between the pleasure principle that seeks satisfaction and the reality principle that enforces restraint. The moral self is born from this conflict. It is not a divine gift, but a psychological construction. If repression were simply evil, we might hope to abolish it. But repression is also the foundation of civilization. Without it, there would be no art, no science, no law. The question, therefore, is not how to destroy repression, but how to make it conscious, how to integrate rather than deny it. Only then can the kind person cease to be the slave of their own goodness and become, instead, the master of their instincts. For what is repressed rules us from below. What is acknowledged obeys us from within. In the smoke-filled rooms of Vienna, where I have spent so many nights listening to the confessions of the unconscious, I have learned that no kindness is pure, but also that no impulse is beyond redemption. The drives that disturb us are the same drives that make love possible. The aggression that terrifies us is the twin of our vitality. If the good person suffers, it is because they have mistaken repression for virtue and guilt for love. They have forgotten that the psyche's wholeness demands the recognition of its darkness. Thus, the machinery of repression, while ingenious, is also tragic. It builds civilization and destroys spontaneity. It protects us from chaos and condemns us to alienation. It transforms desire into morality but leaves the moral soul restless. And beneath every gentle smile, every act of sacrifice, there murmurs the voice of the repressed, asking not to be condemned, but to be known. If we wish to understand the moral character of the so-called good person, we must return to the beginning, to the earliest theater in which the psyche learns its roles, its punishments, and its rewards. There, in the nursery of infancy, before the child has learned to pronounce the word good, the entire drama of morality is already being rehearsed. The child's first love, the first commandment, the first fear, all are born in the presence of the parents. And from this primal relationship emerges the psychic architecture that will govern the adult's notion of kindness, virtue, and sin. The child loves the parent not only because the parent provides nourishment and safety, but because the parent embodies the law. The mother's smile and the father's approval become the signs of existence itself. The infant, sensing the withdrawal of affection as a kind of annihilation, learns that to be loved is to obey. Thus, the seed of morality is planted, not in abstract reason, but in the instinctual fear of losing love. This fear becomes internalized, forming the nucleus of the superego, the moral authority that later governs the adult conscience. What was once the external voice of the parent becomes the internal judge, whispering commands and prohibitions long after the parent's body has vanished from sight. From this psychic inheritance arises the fundamental split within the human being. The id, with its raw drives and primitive demands, continues to cry out for satisfaction, while the superego, that stern descendant of parental law, demands restraint. Between these two stands the ego, that fragile mediator, forever negotiating between desire and duty, pleasure and punishment. In this way, every moral act in adulthood is a reenactment of childhood conflict. When the good person suppresses anger to maintain harmony, they are appeasing not the world, but the internalized parent. When they feel guilt after a moment of selfishness, it is not because the act was truly evil, but because it violated the inner law engraved upon them before they could speak. It is a mistake to imagine that childhood ends when one grows tall. The child lives on within the adult, disguised, but not dead. The good person is often the child who, long ago, was rewarded for obedience and punished for disobedience until their spontaneity shrank in fear. They became good, not by nature but by necessity. This goodness, which society admires, is therefore built upon the ruins of an earlier rebellion. Every yes that the good person utters is haunted by an unspoken no, buried beneath years of conditioning. One might observe this repression most clearly in dreams. For the dream, that nocturnal messenger of the unconscious, never ceases to tell the forbidden truth. The dreamer who sees themselves disobeying, destroying, or defiling is not wicked but honest. In dreams, the moral veil is lifted, and the unconscious reveals the desires that consciousness has exiled. The good person who dreams of betrayal, of sexual pleasure, of rebellion against authority, is not confessing to sin but expressing the natural vitality that their waking life forbids. The dream becomes a stage where the unconscious restores its rights. In analysis, I have witnessed countless examples of this secret theater. The woman who spends her days caring for others, selflessly to the point of exhaustion, dreams of abandoning everyone and walking alone through an empty city. The man who prides himself on his patience dreams of shouting obscenities at his superior. The devout believer dreams of desecrating the altar. These dreams are not moral failures. They are the symbolic compensation for excessive repression. The psyche demands equilibrium. If consciousness insists upon purity, the unconscious insists upon shadow. You see, the moral conscience, the superego, is not, as many suppose, a purely benevolent force. It is both guardian and tyrant. It protects civilization by restraining the instincts, but it does so with cruelty. It inherited the parent's authority, but none of the parent's tenderness. The child, in their helplessness, could endure this tyranny because it was accompanied by love. But in adulthood, the superego continues to punish without mercy. It condemns not only the act, but the impulse, not only guilt, but the thought of guilt. Thus, the good person becomes their own jailer. They patrol their inner life as though it were a battlefield, punishing themselves for desires they never acted upon, for thoughts they never spoke aloud. The formation of the superego, then, is the origin of both morality and neurosis. For the very structure that makes social life possible also ensures that the individual will suffer from an unending internal conflict. The ego is forced to mediate between an insatiable id and a punitive superego, and it does so through repression. The ego represses the drives not because they are dangerous to reality, but because they are dangerous to the ego's self-image as good. The repression, therefore, is an act of self-preservation, yet it is also an act of self-deception. In some sense, the good person is engaged in a lifelong attempt to preserve the illusion of innocence. They must continually silence the voice of instinct that whispers inconvenient truths. This is why such individuals are often obsessed with purity, perfection, and control. They fear that a single crack in their moral facade will allow the flood of repressed material to break through. Their life becomes a delicate performance of virtue, sustained by anxiety. They smile not because they are happy, but because the smile is the last defense against the chaos within. The dream, in contrast, does not smile. It speaks the truth in symbols. It is the language of the unconscious, where morality is suspended and only necessity reigns. When we interpret a dream, we do not moralize it. We translate it. We discover that the dream of violence may express the desire for liberation, that the dream of death may express the wish for transformation, that the dream of infidelity may express the hunger for vitality long denied. The unconscious, like nature, knows nothing of good and evil. It knows only movement, energy, expression. The tragedy of the good person is that they have forgotten this ancient truth. When I speak to my patients about their dreams, I often notice the same expression. First, fear, then relief. Fear, because they recognize in the dream their forbidden desires. Relief, because they realize that to recognize is not to sin. The dream allows what life forbids. It restores the instinctual balance by granting the repressed a symbolic satisfaction. Yet, when the good person wakes, the superego reasserts its reign, declaring the dream wrong, shameful, unholy. The cycle begins again, repression by day, revelation by night. If we could observe the psyche from above, as one might observe the currents of the sea, we would see that repression and expression form a rhythm, a tide of psychic life. The good person, however, attempts to stop this tide, to freeze the flow of desire in the name of morality. But the sea does not obey human law. What is frozen will one day thaw, and what is repressed will one day return. When that return occurs, it often takes the form of anxiety, hysteria, or even physical illness. The body becomes the instrument through which the unconscious speaks when words are forbidden. The chronic headache, the insomnia, the fatigue, these are often the modern manifestations of moral over-control. The psyche punishes not the sin but the repression of it. It is important, then, to recognize that childhood trauma is not limited to the overtly violent or abusive. Even the most loving parent, by the simple act of imposing conditional affection, can create the roots of repression. When the child learns that love must be earned, they also learn to mistrust their spontaneous impulses. They become actors in their own lives, forever performing the role of the good one. This performance, rewarded by society, becomes the prison of the soul. The dreams of such individuals are filled with images of liberation running through forests, flying, breaking through walls, returning to the mother's embrace. These are not random fantasies, but the psyche's attempt to reclaim what was lost in the process of becoming good. The forest, the flight, the broken wall all symbolize the recovery of instinct, the reunion of the self with its repressed vitality. The mother's embrace, in particular, represents the reconciliation with the origin of love before it became conditional. When I analyze these dreams, I do not seek to strip away morality, but to reveal its origins. To understand that our moral sense is born from love and fear, not from reason, is to free ourselves from its tyranny. We can then approach goodness not as a law but as an integration, the conscious acceptance of our instincts rather than their denial. The good person, in the true sense, is not the one who represses desire but the one who understands it, who channels its energy without hatred, who no longer fears the shadow within. It is the repression of the child that becomes the neurosis of the adult. The superego, once necessary for socialization, becomes pathological when it refuses to evolve. The moral code that served the child's survival becomes the prison of the adult's psyche. Thus, many good people remain forever children before their internal parent, seeking approval, fearing punishment, incapable of genuine freedom. They mistake obedience for virtue and guilt for love. To free such a soul is not to teach rebellion but recognition, for rebellion against morality, when unconscious, merely reverses the polarity of repression. It does not heal it. True liberation lies in understanding that the instinctual life is not the enemy of goodness, but its source. To love, to create, to care, these are not acts of repression but of sublimation, of instinct made conscious. The child's energy, once feared and denied, must be invited back into the adult's world, not as chaos, but as vitality. So, when we look upon the face of the good person, we must ask, what child still cries behind that smile? What dreams still speak beneath that silence? What forbidden wishes still seek to live, disguised as generosity or piety? Only by answering these questions can we understand that kindness, in its truest form, is not born of repression, but of reconciliation, the reunion of the child's desire with the adult's consciousness. There is a moment, both in the analytic room and in life itself, when the illusion of moral perfection begins to crumble. It is a quiet but devastating moment, the instant when the so-called good person realizes that their virtue has not brought peace but exhaustion. The perpetual effort to be kind, to be forgiving, to be flawless in thought and conduct, has not purified the soul. It has divided it. And this division, this hidden fracture between the moral ideal and the instinctual reality, is the secret wound that festers beneath the mask of goodness. We must understand that repression is never without cost. The psyche, like the body, can only endure a certain degree of tension before it manifests symptoms. The individual who spends a lifetime repressing hostility, désir, envy, and rage in order to appear good will inevitably suffer from what I have called the return of the repressed. It may not appear as open rebellion more often. It manifests as anxiety, depression, fatigue, or vague discontent. These are not weaknesses of will but expressions of the unconscious, which refuses to be silenced forever. The very energy that was once invested in repression must, at some point, to be paid back, for there are no unpaid debts in the economy of the soul. Consider, for instance, the fatigue of the perpetually kind. It is not merely physical tiredness, it is psychic depletion, the weariness of one who must constantly suppress an inner conflict. The smile that once seemed natural becomes a burden. The duty to forgive becomes a torment. The good person's compassion begins to turn inward as guilt. Why can I not love purely? Why do I feel anger when I should feel understanding? Thus, the superego tightens its grip, punishing not only the act, but the faintest deviation from its impossible ideal. The more the ego strives to meet the demands of the superego, the more it fails, and the more it suffers. This is the tragic paradox of moral perfection. It breeds its own negation. The more one strives to be good, the more one becomes enslaved by guilt. Every act of virtue becomes infected with anxiety, for it must be perfect to satisfy the internal judge. This endless striving is not love of goodness, it is fear of condemnation. The good person does not act freely. They act under the watchful eye of their own conscience, as though an invisible parent stood behind them, ready to withdraw love at the first sign of imperfection. And because the superego is insatiable, it cannot be appeased. Its hunger grows with every sacrifice. It is here that we glimpse the cruelest truth of the human psyche, that the pursuit of absolute goodness may itself become pathological. When morality is stripped of self-knowledge, it becomes a form of self-punishment. The moral masochist is not rare. On the contrary, he is the hidden hero of civilization. He suffers to maintain the illusion that peace can be bought by obedience. His suffering reassures society that its moral law is just. But within him, the repressed instinct still stirs, and its energy, Unexpressed, turns inward as self-destruction. In this sense, we might say that every excessive morality conceals a death instinct. Thanatos, the instinct toward dissolution, finds in moral perfection a disguised form of self-annihilation. The person who renounces all pleasure, all passion, all spontaneity, is not simply virtuous. They are unconsciously courting psychic death. They mistake the stillness of repression for peace. But repression is not silence, it is suffocation. The vitality of eros, the life force, is drained away, and what remains is a sterile purity, a moral desert where nothing grows. Civilization, of course, rewards such individuals. It crowns them with honor, It calls them saints. But the analyst must see beyond appearances. The saintly self-denial that society venerates is often the symptom of an inner war. The more the person denies the instinctual life, the more their unconscious demands compensation. It may come in the form of dreams, fantasies, or sudden lapses, the secret vice that contradicts the public virtue. This, too, is part of the psychic balance. What is repressed morally must return symbolically. To illustrate, let us imagine a man who prides himself on never losing his temper. He believes anger is beneath him, a sign of weakness. But his body tells another story. His jaw tightens, his heart races, his nights are restless. When, in analysis, he allows himself to recall a childhood of domination, of having to obey silently, the truth begins to emerge. His gentleness was not born of love, but of fear. It was a strategy of survival. He learned to suppress his rage not because he was good, but because he was powerless. And so, as an adult, he repeats the pattern. He represses anger to preserve an illusion of control, mistaking fear for virtue. In such a case, to liberate the man from his symptom is not to teach him how to be angry, but to show him that his anger is not evil. It is the voice of a life force long denied. When he dares to feel it consciously, when he admits that his kindness was sometimes submission, his inner world begins to reorganize. The superego loosens its grip, the ego grows stronger, able to hold both tenderness and aggression without fragmentation. This is the beginning of authenticity. Authentic goodness, if such a thing exists, cannot be achieved through repression. It can only arise from integration. When the ego accepts the reality of the instincts, when it no longer needs to deny them, kindness ceases to be a defense and becomes a choice. Love ceases to be a disguise for guilt and becomes an expression of vitality. The good person, in this sense, must die so that the whole person may live. The false saint must dissolve to make room for the human being who is capable of both passion and restraint, of both love and anger. Yet this transformation is not easy, for it requires the courage to confront one's own shadow, to see that within every act of virtue there is a trace of desire, and within every desire, the potential for virtue. It is easier to remain good than to become whole. The former demands obedience, the latter demands consciousness. And consciousness is painful, for it strips away the illusions that have long sustained the ego. But it is only through this pain that true freedom is achieved. In the course of analysis, I have often observed that the most profound moment of healing occurs not when a patient becomes, but when they become honest. Honesty with oneself is the only morality that has no repression behind it. The man who can say, "I hate, I envy, I desire," without shame, is already on the path to genuine kindness, for he no longer projects his darkness onto others, no longer disguises his aggression as virtue. He becomes capable of compassion precisely because he has made peace with his own instincts. The tragedy of the moral perfectionist is that he mistakes guilt for conscience. He believes that suffering proves his goodness. But guilt is not the voice of truth. It is the residue of the parental commandment echoing within. Conscience, in its mature form, is something else entirely. It is not punitive but understanding, not tyrannical but discerning. It arises when the ego, strengthened through self-knowledge, can judge its own impulses without fear. This conscience does not repress the instinct. It regulates it with wisdom. It knows that morality divorced from instinct becomes hypocrisy, and instinct divorced from morality becomes chaos. In this reconciliation lies the future of psychic health, and perhaps the salvation of civilization itself. For the neuroses of individuals are mirrored in the neuroses of societies. A culture that worships purity and punishes instinct will, like the moral perfectionist, eventually collapse under the weight of its own repression. The wars of nations, like the symptoms of patience, are the return of the repressed on a collective scale. The energy denied expression through love and creativity finds expression through destruction. Thus, the fate of the individual psyche and the fate of humanity are not separate. They are reflections of the same inner conflict between Eros and Thanatos. If there is hope, it lies in awareness. The task of psychoanalysis is not to make men moral, but to make them conscious. For only consciousness can transform repression into understanding, guilt into responsibility, instinct into creativity. When the good person dares to look within and sees not a sinner but a human being complex, ambivalent, and alive, then kindness ceases to be a performance and becomes a form of wisdom. Let us therefore not glorify repression as virtue, nor condemn instinct as sin. Let us rather learn to listen to the dialogue between them. For within that dialogue lies the true voice of the self, not the false harmony of perfection, but the living tension of wholeness. To be human is not to be pure. It is to be divided, and yet capable of integration. And perhaps this, finally, is what I would call genuine goodness. The state in which one's compassion includes even the repressed parts of oneself. A kindness that no longer fears the unconscious, but embraces it as part of the same life from which all love arises. Such kindness is not repression disguised, it is reconciliation achieved. It is not the morality of denial, but the morality of understanding. And only through understanding can the psyche find peace, not the peace of suppression, but the peace of truth. In the end, therefore, the hidden repression behind kindness reveals not the falseness of virtue, but the complexity of being human. The good person is not a liar, they are a sufferer, caught between the ancient forces that shape us all. Their struggle, if brought into consciousness, can become the seed of a new morality, one that accepts the instinct, forgives the shadow, and transforms repression into self-knowledge. For when man ceases to fear his own depths, he no longer needs to disguise his light. He becomes, at last, not good in appearance, but whole in truth.